Welcome everyone to the Life Planning Network virtual meeting for July with our guest Connie Zweig. I'm Bruce Frankel, the president of LPN, and I'm really excited for hearing Connie today. It's my great privilege to introduce one of LPN's many shining stars, Connie Zweig, the author of The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, which many of us have profited from over the last year, working in groups and doing interactive readings of it. And she's also now the author of Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, which is the subject of today. She's written a number of other books on the shadow. And, you know, as I've said before, I can't recommend The Inner Work of Age strongly enough. It's a really terrific book for provoking thought about how to transform ourselves as we age. And Connie is a retired psychotherapist and former executive editor of Jeremy P. Tarsher Publishing. In addition, she's been practicing and teaching meditation for about 50 years, she says. So before we dig in, Connie, maybe you could set the stage a little by sharing with us why this book, why now, what led you to write it, and what you hope it accomplishes.
Oh, only that. Okay.
Only that.
So I want to thank you all for your precious time, for coming to join me and Bruce. And we decided to do this as a conversation between us rather than a formal presentation today, because so many of us are zoomed out. So this book has had a very long life inside of me, actually, and in the world. I began meditation when I was at school in Berkeley at 19, because I wanted to date a guy who wouldn't go out with me unless I was doing TM. And no holy reason, right? And so I began TM as kind of a naive young kid. And I found that it really quieted my mind and calmed me down, and my anger began to dissipate. I was very engaged politically in Berkeley, and my anger began to dissipate. And so I got more and more involved in meditation retreats and eventually became a TM teacher. And slowly over the next 10 years, I began to notice that there were changes in the community and in the teacher. And that what started out as a really kind of open, non-hierarchical group with a vision of, well, do you remember all that stuff in the 70s, right? The New Age and all that, we were going to enlighten the world. So what started out very kind of open-hearted began to become more rigid, more hierarchical. And eventually we discovered that Maharishi, the teacher, was having sex while telling his students to be celibate. And I began to become disillusioned and kind of struggled with the hypocrisy and the contradictions. Most of the people around me were not struggling with it. They were finding all kinds of rationalizations. It's just about the technique, and, you know, it's not about him, and all this kind of thing. So I left in 1979 and lost my community, my purpose, my practice, and over the years began to kind of understand, as I trained as a psychologist, what drew me to this group, what spiritual yearning is about for so many people, why we get really invested in charismatic teachers. I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation called The Holy Longing, which is based on a poem by Goethe that's about the longing for transcendence or for spirit, or the poets call it the soul's longing for the beloved. And I tried to understand that through the lenses of psychology, the different schools of psychology. So this has been with me for a long time. A couple of very early editions of the book came out. And then recently, with the Me Too movement and its impact on the culture around sexual harassment and accountability, I began to think about applying some of that to religious and spiritual settings, because, Me Too was mostly in secular settings. And I began to interview people, and both teachers and survivors, and read more, do more research about the current scandals that are going on in the churches, in the satsangs, in the zendos, with shamans and roshis and rabbis in every tradition. There are many, many teachers and clergy who are acting out their shadows now. And there are a lot of people feeling traumatized, abused and traumatized and disillusioned. And I felt that depth psychology had something to offer. It has insight and guidance about how to understand this and how to recover from it. So that's really what motivated me. The publisher of The Inner Work of Age was so thrilled with the reception of the book that they asked me to revise this book. And so it's very revised and updated, and I'm excited about it to be teaching this material now.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great introduction. And I don't know if I can get my camera to focus successfully on the book, but it really is. I started reading it, and like Connie's other book, it's extraordinarily well written, and I encourage everyone to look at it, read it.
Thank you, Bruce.
As you know, Connie is a really depth writer. So Connie, maybe we should go back to the beginning of this, since you mentioned Goethe, and ask the question, what is this being insane for light that Goethe talks about? What is holy longing?
So, have any of you noticed that you have a kind of restlessness for something more? And that there's a whisper that comes up inside of you sometimes, there must be more. There's something mysterious here that I haven't found or understood yet. I know my ego isn't all of who I am. In the last book, I wrote about role to soul, which was shifting our identity from what we do to who we really are. And I think the holy longing is a yearning for who we really are. It's a yearning to expand our identity and connect with whatever we call it, the universe or spirit or true nature or higher self, whatever your language is, Christ nature, Buddha nature. The longing is to experience that. And there are many people who are not consciously seekers and don't consciously experience that. And then there are other people who feel that throughout their lives and allow it to guide them. So it guides them to books or to communities or to teachers or to practices. And, one of the possibilities is that it guides us to a teacher who may be spiritually developed, but is not perfect and has his or her own shadow material, his or her unhealed wounds, blind spots, flaws. And so that teacher then acts out in a way that's destructive or harmful to the students. And so that's what I mean by meeting the shadow on the spiritual path. We meet the dark side of a clergy person, or we meet the shadow in ourselves.
Just
Let,
maybe not to interrupt, but maybe for those who aren't really familiar with what the shadow means in this vernacular, if you could tell us a little about, I mean, what the
yeah,
shadow is for those, define it a little for those who aren't
okay.
familiar.
So Carl Jung coined the term shadow to refer to the personal unconscious, that part of us that's outside of our conscious awareness, in the darkness rather than in the light of awareness. And so anything at all can go into the shadow. If we're in childhood, somebody tells us that our anger is bad and we should never show it, then those authentic feelings get repressed or banished into the shadow. Or if your sadness is bad, that can go into the shadow. If your sexuality is shamed, but also your talents. If you are naturally artistic and your family doesn't support that or they dismiss it, your gifts can go into the shadow. So feelings, traits, abilities, dreams, and aspirations can be buried, and sometimes for a long time. Sometimes they will erupt at midlife. You know, some of you may have seen friends kind of crash their lives in a midlife crisis because they want to live out what's been unexpressed for them. And then we have a late life identity crisis that we talk about. And some of us want to explore the material of our unlived lives, whether it's creativity or feelings or behaviors that have been buried in the shadow for a long time. So the shadow is not just bad. I mean, that's the, you know, it's kind of popularly misunderstood as evil or sinful or bad. It's bad in relation to the ego. So if your ego, you know, says that feeling angry is bad or feeling sexual is bad, then that material goes into the shadow. But we all know that anger and sexuality are not bad.
What's the danger of it going into the shadow?
Well, we all need to be socialized in order to function in society. And so we can't live out everything. We can't live out 100% of our possibilities. Hi, Barbara, I'm glad you're here. So it's inevitable that material is going to go into the shadow for each of us. What's dangerous is that we can lose contact with our authenticity. So let's say we grow up and we join a spiritual community, as I did, and we find that sort of in the group think of the community, extreme feelings are looked at as bad because meditation brings equanimity. So nobody should really be in grief or in too much anger or in too much sexiness or in too much whatever it is. And so what happens is we lose contact with those authentic feelings and impulses. And we could say we lose parts of the self. So for me, when I joined that TM community, I didn't have any career ambition. I didn't develop intimate relationship skills. My development stalled in certain ways because I was only focused on my spiritual development, and everything else got banished into the shadow.
I'm going to ask a double-barreled question, I'm afraid, but is that why in the spiritual arena, spiritual leaders sometimes act out in ways that you are unexpected because they haven't negotiated those parts of the shadow? And maybe you could add into that why you extended your work into the spiritual arena, although I think you've kind of touched on that a bit.
Yeah, I also want to mention, feel free to put anything in the chat, comments or questions if something comes up. We're going to have a conversation soon, but feel free to do that. I'll respond. So this question of why do so many clergy people and spiritual leaders and teachers, rabbis and priests, gurus and shamans and roshis, why do they act out their shadows around power, sex, and money? Why does this happen? And it's really complex because each of them has different psychology, right? So I can find general patterns around this, but I can't say why this particular person did that particular thing, right? So often people who are focused on spiritual development may not be doing their ego's homework. They may not be doing psychological work, emotional work, relational skills, and they also might not be doing moral development. And so what ends up happening is they're carrying a lot of projection, because a lot of this relationship is about the student or believer projects the ideal onto the teacher or priest, right? That person is closer to God, or that person is more enlightened or more compassionate than I am, right? So it's not only one way. The teacher then is carrying this projection. In India, teachers are carrying projections of millions of people, a lot of those gurus. So what happens to the teachers carrying that idealization of so many people? And they're isolated. They have no peer support. They don't know about their own flaws, their own psychologies, their own missing parts, right? They may have been raised in another culture, let's say in Asia, that is sexist, that is monastic, that is that gives them a sense of entitlement because, you know, they're born into a lineage and they're told they're a special lama. And so they have a sense of specialness and entitlement. And they come to the West, and there's all this individualism and freedom of expression and sexual expression. And so one of the issues is a culture clash. That's one thing that happens. But also, some of these people may have really narcissistic tendencies or even be sociopaths. In chapter 5 of the book, I tell a lot of stories of scandals of teachers and clergy people who have acted out their shadows based on published reports, memoirs, newspapers, and interviews. And I'm convinced from this research that some of these people are really sociopathic and they don't have conscience. And so they're not feeling how they're hurting people. And they're in a position where they're saying to people, you know, we're in a sacred relationship where there's no harm. And yet they're acting out very destructive and harmful behavior, whether it's, you know, and if you want me to, I'll name a few names and tell some.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask you,
but,
maybe
you know,
if you would name a few names and maybe highlight one or two of the things, the individuals.
Okay, well, one that's very well known is Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche from Shambhala in Boulder. Meg is shaking her head. So in that community, Chogyam Rinpoche was came from, I forget if it was Nepal or India. I think it was Nepal or Tibet, rather. I think it was Tibet. And, you know, he was pronounced a lama as a child. He came here. He built this community and he became an alcoholic. And he sexually assaulted women in his community. Everybody rallied around him, made all kinds of rationalizations to try to justify this behavior, spoke about crazy wisdom, which is a tradition of teaching that the teacher can do anything. The teacher who's enlightened can do no wrong. So whatever he does is to teach you and to wake you up from ignorance. When he died of alcoholism, everyone denied that the alcohol, that he died of that. It wasn't possible because, he had the alcohol didn't affect him that way. And then his chosen heir took over the community and also acted out sexually, knowing that he had HIV, and actually gave AIDS to several people. And then when he died, Chogyam, the original teacher, his son took over, and that son began to commit sexual assault on women and eventually had to be banished to Nepal. So that community is now trying to figure out, how to reorganize and heal.
So that provokes the question, having gone to see Barbie over the weekend, do women ever become vulnerable in the same way when they're spiritual leaders, or are only men so dysfunctional?
Everyone asked me that. So there are stories of women as spiritual teachers acting out their shadows. However, they're more rare because the systems are patriarchal. So most of the leaders are men, whether it's, priests or rabbis or gurus or lamas, most of them are men. But there are some stories of teachers who, female teachers who rage at their students, who physically abuse them, who lose it in front of people. One who kind of acted out sexually in secret. So, there are a lot of patterns to this abuse that happens. And for me as a psychologist, what I saw was that they operate like alcoholic families, where the teacher or leader or father, is abusive and tells everyone to keep the secret. And the secret is like the glue that holds the system together. And it's very hard in this kind of community to become a whistleblower and speak out because of the risk of being excommunicated, being shunned, being pushed out, being shamed, and so on. And this is not only in cults. I mean, this is obvious with things like Scientology, but these are communities that we don't think of as cults. They have lineages and they have valid practices and teachings. Some of the teachers are transmitting great wisdom. So this is not black and white. This is not like a good and evil situation. I'm really trying to explore the nuance of what happens.
And denominations it doesn't make a difference. The patterns hold true across denominations.
Across all denominations, yeah.
Interesting. We do have a question from Ulysses that will pop in here. And I believe Ulysses is coming to us from the Philippines. He says, I am loving this lecture. As an aspiring values education teacher, Connie's insights are valuable, especially that this phenomenon, the shadow, is prevalent in my country as well.
Yeah, Ulysses, if you could find the name of the documentary on Netflix, I would love to know. There are several films about this now that are streaming. Wild Wild Country is a fantastic documentary about the Rajneesh Osho community. I think it was last on Netflix. The Vow is on HBO Max. And it is about the Nixium community, if you've heard of that. It was kind of like an Est kind of thing in LA. And that teacher is in prison. It's one of the very few religious spiritual leaders who's actually gone to jail over his behaviors. So that's if you're interested in this, The Vow is really interesting because you can watch how people get caught. You can see how much they're learning and growing and appreciating it. And then you see what's going on behind the scenes secretly. Keith Raniere was seducing young women and girls, and most people didn't know about it. So it's, and there's also some of you may not relate to this if you didn't have an experience of overt religious abuse, but there's more covert abuse, like shaming. Perhaps, you've been in a religious institution where you've seen a teacher or priest shame someone or control them by using the fear of damnation or the fear of a bad reincarnation, for example, to get obedience. So there's a range of transgressions. It doesn't have to be as overt as what I'm describing.
I have a few more questions, but I think I'd love to bring the rest of the group in, and we can come back to questions if, but does anyone have any questions they would like to pose at this point?
I have a question. I'm Nancy. I am curious at the beginning of what you were talking about in relation to starting to question beyond your role, like who you are.
Yes.
And I can really relate to that strongly. Because for myself, I have had this longing probably for the last year or so of like, who am I? Like I basically know what my core values are and how I apply them. That's the key. It's in the doing as opposed to the being. And you mentioned that this is not uncommon as people get older. And I just was curious what you can say even more about that. If there's something more you can say about that. Is there something about us human beings that or maybe it's American human beings, I don't know, but what's that about?
Well, I think for people who are struggling with survival needs, this is a luxury. So I wouldn't just say American, I would say people who are looking for food are not necessarily asking, who am I? But when we are, in a moment in which we're comfortable, or we're in a transition in which there's a lot of certainty and a lot of our needs are met, then this question, who am I, comes up. And in our culture, it comes up in adolescence and at midlife, and again at late life, what I call the late life identity crisis. And from my point of view, the answers are complex and individual. So for me, my life has kind of addressed this question through the lifespan. But for someone else, it might be new, and they may find that it's about doing. It's about, like you said, living your values, feeling congruent with what you believe, walking your talk, whatever name you give to that. For me, that's just a part of it. For me, it's more about a level of consciousness in which I identify with the non-doing part, the unchanging part, the God within.
Yes.
Or spirit.
Right. The spirit, the soul.
Yeah. So I think this is an individual journey, even though many of us are kind of walking parallel paths.
Thank you.
Anita? You're not.
You're muted.
So.
Anita, you're muted.
That worked out? Okay.
That's it. You're
I apologize for coming late. I had another situation going on here in my house that I had to deal with. And so this may be off point, but I'm a fan of a religious psychologist or a spiritual psychologist named Tom Yeomans. I don't know if you know him. And what he has said is a stunning paradox of human spiritual maturity is that as we become one with all life, we also at the same time become completely and uniquely ourselves. And
Beautiful.
is that relevant to what we're talking about?
That's beautiful. Yeah. So we open to this level of interconnectedness that always already is. And at the same time, we live in our individuality in the body mind.
Yeah.
Right? And we become more authentically ourselves because we have less need to have a persona. We have less need to look good or sound smart or whatever the kind of performance we were doing before to gain love and approval. We don't need that anymore when we're really interconnected with everything, all living things. So yeah, well said as a paradox.
Yeah, and Anita, would you mind putting the name of Youngins into the chat box too?
It's
that-
Tom Humans. I can even type in the
Humans.
quote. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, sure, it'd be lovely.
Okay,
Yeomans, Yeomans.
correct.
Great.
So Kendall, we always speak different languages. So I'm going to ask you to translate your language here. How do I know what my real shadow is as opposed to an invented semi-dark romantic philosophic shadow? What does that mean?
Well, well, the idea is, like I could come up with kind of like some angsty kind of shadow, and it's kind of like, oh, this feels dark and wonderful, and I can sort of go off on this really sort of, kind of ride off in the darkness with his shadow because it feels really kind of like there's a lot to chew on. But I don't know if, it's just an invented one. It's kind of like I'm trying to sort of get to the authentic shadow as a one that kind of as a look-alike shadow. And so I spend, I'm afraid that I kind of drift in between what is real shadow and a kind of a faux shadow. I mean, particularly in my art, I kind of do things that look kind of, poignant and dark enough to kind of, well, that must be sort of shadow image for me. But I'm afraid of illusioning myself and thinking that's not really the work I have to do. It just looks like the work I have to do.
So because you're so visual and you're doing shadow work with your art, what I would suggest is when you look at an image and you wonder if it's a real shadow or not, or if it's something that's, the way I would translate it is if it's something that's arising from your unconscious, or it's just something that your conscious mind is kind of making up. What I would ask you to do is sit for a moment and kind of feel or sense the difference for you. So you're looking at an image or you're thinking of some part of yourself. Stop and just reflect for a moment, because by definition, a shadow part is unconscious until it's not. So until it's put on the canvas, or until, when we were working on the inner work of age, let's say the inner ageist shadow. So most of us have an internalized ageism, and I turn that into a shadow character that I call the inner ageist. Once it's conscious and we become aware of how it's affecting us and how we're carrying our ageism, it's not in the shadow anymore, right? By definition, it's in our awareness. It may slink back and hide for a while, right? And then you may find yourself having an ageist projection onto somebody and go, oh, there's the inner ageist again. But, so it does kind of go back and forth. But my sense is that you can discriminate and see, is this just a creation of your mind? Or is this something that's really arising from your unconscious in your, in the deep body mind to the surface? And I think that's a lovely question for artists, because, art and creativity is really a way to express these hidden feelings and parts of ourselves that we've kind of kept in the closet.
Great.
Thank you. That's helpful. Yeah.
Karen, you have to unmute yourself. Karen.
Kind of at the risk of going off a little bit, I'm curious about if there's a correlation that you can make in psychological terms with political leaders and religious cult like spiritual path leaders that elicit this
Absolutely.
A great question.
Absolutely. So in almost every group, people are asking me about Trump. And, you know, I'm a little bit wary because I don't know people's personal politics. So, and I'm so happy to see Anna because I haven't seen you for a long time, Anna. So, you know, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. So let's try to talk about it psychologically rather than politically. So, you know, there is a cult-like following around Trump in the sense that people project onto him the savior, the rescuer, the fixer, right? The one who knows, the one who has answers, the one who has risen to the top, from the bottom to the top, right? All kinds of projections. And what happens is people get invested then in that relationship in the same way they do with a clergy person. Their identity is invested in the projection and in the beliefs around it, in the beliefs of the tribe. So belonging is really important in religious communities and in political communities. So we all have our political tribes. It's like sports teams. You know, I'm not a sports person, but I just watched a couple of episodes of Ted Lasso to see what everybody was talking about. Fanaticism around your team. And what that is it's tribalism. There's a sense of belonging to a tribe, and it's the same thing that Trump has elicited and that a lot of these teachers elicit. And then there's the in-group and the out-group. And then there's a projection onto the people outside of the tribe as enemy or deep state or, you know.
What makes people susceptible, though, to giving up all critical view of that? So some people who are soccer fans or baseball fans may love their teams, but they retain a sense of humor and perspective, and the same is true in politics. Some people lose it. So where's the line between that? Why does it occur?
Well, I don't know, but my hunch about that is that the people who are filling up their own emptiness get more invested. Their identity is more invested with their soccer team or their political tribe. They may be isolated in other ways. They may be without meaning outside of that. And now, with the way that the media is siloed, they're only getting certain kinds of information, and that's creating a feedback loop. So, I could go into the psychological diagnoses that I think make people susceptible, but I don't think that's the right thing to do. But the people here, if there are any psychologists here, you probably know what I'm talking about. So, there's a sense of that what's happened since Trump came on the scene, that it's new, but it's not. He brought it all out of the closet. And this kind of rage and projection and tribalism was always there, hidden away. We can see it in other cultures more easily.
Why do you think he became such a magnificent carrier of it, though? Why did he become, it has always been there, but we haven't seen such a
Bruce, I read that his daughter said that he read Hitler's Mein Kampf every night.
Oh, Jesus.
He studied how to be a cult leader. He studied it. So he studied how to cultivate the projection onto himself, how to make people feel like a tribe, how to enrage them to violence. I mean, he looked to me like a total buffoon, but he was actually very skillful at doing this.
Yeah.
And the same is true with some spiritual leaders. They're using very similar methods. And, you know, we've all seen how he uses shame and name calling. And anyway, so we've really seen a lot of the tools. It's been very out in the open. So Lisa's been waiting.
Yeah. Lisa,
Oh, this is fascinating. Thank you so much. I was in what could probably be termed a small cult, in and out for about 20 years. And so everything you're saying resonates with me. The woman who formed this group was my therapist originally. She sort of got a little nuttier over the years. And I'm curious. I was definitely projecting all over her and did have that feeling that I would be damned if I left, that I would be horribly selfish and my soul would just be in tatters. So all of that was happening, which I think you described. I'm curious about, she was, I'm pretty sure, a sociopath, or I would certainly, she was expert at getting in. She knew all my vulnerabilities. I mean, I'd been in therapy with her, so I guess I kind of divulged some of these things. But it was almost like she could just zero right in. It was an instinct for how to dig the knife in and twist it. And I wonder if you could speak a little more to that aspect. Or if that's just kind of something, it's like a gift that certain sociopaths seem to have, and it's terrifying.
Well, thank you for your openness to share that, Lisa. You know, it's upsetting to me to hear that a therapist treated her clients like that. The training for good therapy is to carry that projection that I'm talking about, that transference, and then at a certain point to return it to the client so that the client is empowered. But if the therapist holds the power for indefinitely, then the relationship is so unequal and the client becomes subordinate. And it sounds like that's what happened if she gathered a group, you know, and tried to start a movement. It sounds like the power shadow kind of an ego inflation kind of got a hold of her. And
yeah, I would say it got darker as the years progressed.
yeah.
And I did get a lot out of it at the beginning. It wasn't like,
Yeah.
like what you said with the TM. It was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. They can be very positive experiences and then they can turn dark and dangerous.
Yeah.
And this is why what I'm trying to share with people is how to cultivate shadow awareness. So you're seeing the shadow in yourself. What am I denying? What red flags am I not paying attention to? What are my unmet needs that I'm bringing here? Why am I staying, right? What is my loyalty really about? Do I want to be obedient? Why? Do I want to be told what to do? Why? And to really keep asking these questions and at the same time, cultivate shadow awareness in the teacher. What am I seeing about this man or woman that's off? My body is telling me it's dangerous, or my intuition is telling me something's not right. And to actually learn how to pay attention and see the other person's shadow issues. Everybody has them. This is just part of being human.
Yeah.
And even people who are in advanced stages of consciousness, you know, and have had spiritual awakenings, still have shadow material and are still at risk for acting it out. So Meg, hi.
Hello. There's so much of Rich in here and I keep sort of bouncing back and forth. So I have a few little comments, if that's okay.
Good.
So just to add about Trump, I think that his people, it's many of them have this sense of losing out in our society. And I think that's also one of the reasons that he appeals to them. And also it's already been suggestion, but I think he's both a narcissist and a sociopath. And that sort of ties in with some of the religious figures. And here's a question I'll throw out, but I wanted, before I do that, Kendall, one technique I have used for trying to figure out what my shadow is to see what triggers me. Because I think that when somebody triggers me, it's something, and I get angry, it's something I don't want to see in myself. So that's just one little thing I learned.
Good, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'll draw
And,
a trigger and see where that goes with you. Yeah, thank you.
And then let's see, there was a question. Well, I'll just mention that I was a part of, but very tangentially, but my sister was a big part of Kripalu, whose leader is also probably in your chapter. And that was very interesting. And he's one of the ones that finally had to leave.
Yes.
But it was a very painful experience for most people. And and very costly for the first whistleblower who was forced to leave.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Kripalu Yoga Center was in Massachusetts. I think it's in Rhinebeck now.
Is it? I think it's.
No, I think it's still in Lennox.
It's in
Oh,
Lennox.
it is? Okay. He was found to be having sex with a student. I believe, was he married at the time?
Yes.
Yeah.
And there was this whole big deal about the real followers had to be abstinent. And
yes, and
the
people had to be celibate, right? So there was
Except for
that
him.
hypocrisy going on. Then he denied the affair.
Right.
Then somebody else came and said, I had sex with him, and he finally admitted it. The good news about that story is that they ended up bringing in consultants and therapists and really trying to reimagine the community. And he did try to make amends. He came to some understanding of psychology and said, that traditional guru student model doesn't work here, and I can see that. And even though he left Kripalu, there was a real redesign of the community, and that's a very positive outcome. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. And one last question, and this is maybe too much. I'll just throw it out. You were talking about how important it is to educate people about shadow. And but when it's 40% of the country almost, what do you do? How do you get to this?
Bird by bird.
Very good.
well, yeah. There are people who believe we can only work on ourselves and, shed light on our own darkness. There are people who believe we need to be really socially active and engaged with the social justice issues that we're passionate about and contribute in any way we can, whether it's, climate or guns or racism or whatever it is, or democracy now. And so I think this is an individual choice. It's urgent and it's, it's pressing on all of us. And I'm concerned about the political stuff for so many reasons. But, we're all, I think in this group, we're all doing what we can to educate and support each other to follow our passions and use our energy for the common good. And that's really all we can do.
Well said. So
Thank you.
Anita, is your hand still up from before, or is that a last question?
It doesn't have to be a last
Oh,
question.
no, but please ask, go ahead. I have one last question, but I'll hold mine till after you go, so please.
Okay. In fact, the question or my comment was in connection to what you were wondering about out loud, Bruce, about what draws, we've talked about what personality characteristics or psychological traits make a cult leader. But the other side of that question is what draws people in.
Yeah.
And I have, I'm thinking of a couple of patients I've seen from people who are from what I would call a cult. They probably wouldn't, but it's a religious group where the brainwashing is so intense and destructive that you are convinced that if you don't think in this particular way, that you are not worthy of God.
Yeah.
And if you're not worthy of God, you will be excommunicated from the community.
Yeah.
And I could go on for a very long time because speaking of triggers, it triggers me to hear that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think that it's the security that is a sense of security that is provided by community in this warped way that pulls people into this kind of thing. And they know, and as you said, they project everything outside of their beliefs are the enemy. But they, because they're secure in their group, are holy and blessed and superior.
Yeah. So, this us them thinking is as old as humanity. And it's just taken on all these different forms. We could look at human history and see it in so many ways. I was speaking to somebody this week who grew up in a Mormon fundamentalist community and what she went through. I mean, I would say that fundamentalisms across the denominations suffer more with this than the lineages that are sort of more liberal and open-minded. So, if you look at fundamentalist Judaism as opposed to Reform Judaism, you can see clear differences in independent critical thinking, authentic feelings, capacity for agency, but part of what's happening now is that people are leaving the churches. Did you see that article in the New York Times about the unchurched?
Yep.
People are leaving organized religion in mass numbers now and looking for alternatives and longing, right, for something more. And so, and there are many people who are having authentic spiritual awakenings. I don't know if you guys are interested, but there's a podcast called Buddha at the Gas Pump. And he has interviewed like 700 people who are having profound spiritual awakenings. And once in a while, one of them decides to become a teacher. And that person has no preparation to teach, no psychological work, no moral development, they just go teach. So this is what's going on now. And I wanted to offer, guidance and recovery. The second half of the book is about how to heal from this kind of trauma, how to recover your inspiration after disillusionment. And then I want to get to Bruce, but I'm going to also offer an invitation. We've lost so many people already. So part of, when I published The Inner Work of Age, we formed circles as we did at LPN. And people read the book together and did the practices together. So I'm doing the same thing with this book. So there are many circles now of people forming free circles online to read the book and do the practices together. And so if you're interested in that, you can email me, conniezweig@gmail.com, and you can put spiritual shadow work in the subject line, and be sure to give me your time zone. And I'll connect you with other people and you can form a circle and support each other to do this recovery work.
I wanted to just ask one question that's been going through my mind since we are a group about positive aging, which is there a difference in, we often hear about young people who are brought into cults, but is there a difference in terms of people's susceptibility along age lines? Are older people also susceptible in ways that are unexpected? Or,
you know, I'm so glad you brought this up. For me, I think what's important in our stage of life is we all talk about completing unfinished business, but what about our spiritual unfinished business? What about taking the time to really examine what we believe now about death or life after death? What we believe about our holy longing and what we're seeking and to connect to? What we are experiencing with our practices, are they the right practices for us now at this stage of life? And then also to repair some of these traumas. So, you know, as I said, my TM story was in my 20s. Many baby boomers went for spirituality in our 20s. If we look back, if you do a life review and you really see when you had some of these religious betrayals or spiritual traumas, you want to repair them now, just like you want to give and receive forgiveness in your relationships or whatever other healing work you're doing. So for me, completing spiritual unfinished business is part of the story for this stage of life.
would you give us I'm very grateful for that answer. Would you give us a peek, and then Joan, after I finish, give us a peek into what that self-rehabilitation or repair looks like?
Yeah, so are you at this moment projecting onto someone your spiritual nature, your light, your essence? Are you imagining that you need that person to be an intermediary to connect to the divine? And if so, what is going into your shadow if you're doing that now?
Interesting.
Are you stuffing any feelings or thoughts or doubts in order to be a part of a church community or a synagogue or a sangha? Is there anything that's going into the shadow because of how you're living your spiritual life that you might really want to reclaim now? And is there anything that you're not saying? You know, we spoke about whistleblowers. Is there anything you need to say to someone? It could be a peer or a teacher or a clergy person or one of your children or grandchildren. What do you want to speak about this now? And this is kind of in the context of our mortality, right? We don't want to be on our deathbed with trauma and regret about how we lived our lives. And so we have this opportunity to be able to clarify some of this now and complete it.
Great.
Complete it as we move to the end of our lives.
That's great. Joan, I'm going to give you the honors of the last question before we close, but
no, it's not a question. You know, Connie, I always so appreciate your work and, you know, your incredible intelligence in articulating these complex issues. You know, I have not experienced, I was not part of TM or any of this stuff, so I don't feel I'm in recovery personally, but looking ongoing for spiritual practice, you know, practices now at this stage of life. And I guess it's probably not time, but I wonder, given all your wisdom and experience, are there a few simple, for example, of just first time joined a mindfulness group. I've not meditated. I've not been in any transcendental medication kinds of things. But are there a few simple practices that you would suggest to us, you know, those of us in our aging journeys around, you know, this issue?
Well,
So
there
that
are
might
lots
be a
of,
bigger question to
yeah,
ask.
it's a big question. There are lots of practices in the inner work of age.
Oh, I know that. Yeah, no, I
Lots of
know
them.
about.
Yeah.
But any additional ones that you're thinking of now, given this journey?
Do you feel a connection to any lineage?
Oh, totally, totally.
Which lineage?
Oh, my Jewish family, my family, extended family, Judaism, and I'm thinking.
Okay.
Place now, yeah, I'm thinking a lot about that.
And
yeah.
so have you explored mystical practices from Judaism?
No.
That's what I would suggest.
Okay, yeah.
There are many beautiful mystical practices and literature. God, I remember reading, let me write down his name, Joan. The Adin Steinsaltz, the 13-petaled rose.
Okay.
There are all kinds of mystical teachings within Judaism that, you know, don't show up for some reason. I mean, obviously there's Kabbalah, but there have been a lot of scandals around Kabbalistic teachers in the contemporary world. So you can do classes, but you also just want to watch for red flags. So, you know, you could look for Kabbalah where you are and check it out. But that's what I would suggest. My husband was trained in Judaism, and he meditated on the Shema for a long time. Like the Shema, like a mantra. So I would suggest, if you feel some resonance with the lineage, to explore inside of that in the less conventional ways, in the more experiential ways, which tend to be more mystical.
Great.
Well, so I'm going to bring this to a close, though I'm sure we could go on and continue this conversation for a long time, but I would say encourage everyone to buy and read Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path. And, you know, maybe if people read it, and Connie, maybe you'd be willing to come back at some point during the year if there's interest in having a conversation after people have had a chance to.
I would love that.
So
That'd
it might
be great, Bruce. I'd love that.
extend the conversation in some other way. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
a virtual meeting. It's just be a meeting on a given day that we all want, because I think it's rich subject matter. And
That'd be great.
as Joan so perfectly said, you know, we're grateful for your wisdom and for your beautiful articulation of all these ideas. So we honor you and grateful for you, and thank everyone for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Bruce. Love to everybody.